Yep, good, okay. So you notice you're going really well when you're walking into the room and you hear that the session's already starting. All right, managing multiple versions. I'm going to be brave and take the subject on. So, first of all, a feature of the way FHIR works is that we make multiple releases of FHIR. We've made 4 major releases, and there's some users, some communities out there still running on some of our interim releases. So by my count, there's about 9 versions running in production. But there's 4 that the team supports, which are releases 2, 3, and 4. And by arrangement with a particular community, the May 2016 version is in use in one particular community, and they help us support them in doing so. And we're currently working on release 5, so that'll add to the mix. And so as you all know, that over time, we make breaking changes to the content. Now, not everybody's really pleased about us making breaking changes to the content. A bunch of people think it would be just better if we got it right the first time, and then we didn't need to make any changes. But all we know how to do, and we've demonstrated this over a 30-year period, is get it wrong the first time. And our process is really a discovery process around putting it out there, letting people bang away on it, tell us where the right balance is, and the things that we've missed. And over time, the changes ripple down, and we do last call, and then so the change is slowing. And so that's the maturity process that we have. Every artifact goes through the maturity process. One of the insiders will put up a draft, and everybody looks at it and goes, that's entirely not what we're doing. You've completely missed the point. And so resources come, and then they disappear, and then they come back again, and then they disappear and come with a different name and a different scope, or we move things around. But then they start settling, and then we start arguing about the elements inside them, and then the terminologies, and eventually that stops as well, and we do last call, and then we're done. Which is when we get to normative content. You see, I copied and pasted this slide. I missed the later this year bit. It's from last year, this presentation last year. Now we have normative content, which is content that we guarantee we won't make breaking changes to. We might add new elements or so forth, but we believe that they've had enough use to justify calling them normative. People can not change going forwards. In the meantime, we will continue to support multiple versions which are different to each other. When we actually started, we've been a bit slow to get on top of this, because when we started, we basically thought there'd be 1, 2, 3 releases, and the 3rd release would be normative. And then we'd be done with the problem. But over time, we've realized that the actual process of incubating each different artifact through that maturity process is a value proposition to everybody in the community. There's only one way to find out what the right balance is. And so we will continue to do that going forwards. And in the meantime, we will be supporting multiple versions. So we have a full release history. So every specification in the FHIR family that we publish comes with a directory file, a history list, that tells you all the versions that have been published, and every one of those published pages is built dynamically from a JSON file called packagelist.json, which any software application can access, which will it contains all the information that we have, and you can use it however you want, and so that's what I maintain. And so here's a quick look at the package list. It's really simple. The canonical URL of whatever specification it is, /package-list.json, will give you this file, which describes the specification and gives you a list of released versions and where they are found. Every spec has that, because that page that you see as a human is built from this page. So if you're ever interested, there's actually some central JSON files that tell you all the places you can find these files. And so our entire publication history is navigable from JSON, if ever any of you are interested in doing that. What we do know is that versioning is expensive. In the past, version 2 interfaces, version changes have been very, very expensive, to the point where I routinely hear that vendors have charged hundreds of thousands of dollars for changing one bit in a message to change from 2.3 to 2.4 when nothing else changed. So it's obviously a profitable arrangement for some, but it's generally not played out very well for healthcare. So we tried to keep versioning out of the FHIR resources because it just is not a profitable way to go about things. But the thing that I've learned in my 25 years writing code is that if there's one thing that we will argue about, it's versioning. And we have argued about versioning a lot. And I fully expect that people will come down here after this presentation and argue with me about versioning. Because that's what we do. If you look up IT in the dictionary, you'll find something about versioning arguments. But I can say some useful things about versioning, supporting multiple versions. I'm going to talk about 4 different subjects when it comes to supporting multiple versions of FHIR. I'm going to talk about converting between versions. I'm going to talk about an API strategy for handling multiple versions. I'm going to talk a little bit about persistence strategies and applications. And I'm going to talk a little bit about documentation strategy for cross-version documentation. So that's the 4 aspects of versioning that I'm going to talk about. So, first of all, when it comes to converting between versions, each version of the major specification that we publish includes a pretty detailed list of the differences between this version of the specification and the last one. And so here you can see the changes in observation between R3 and R4. They were not remarkable. It doesn't account for the changes in the narrative. In fact, if you're interested in the changes in the narrative, there's a link at the bottom of every page to do a diff of the page with the previous with the same page in the previous version of FHIR. And that just calls out to a W3C HTML diff server that will return you a page that shows you what's changed on the page. So that's the human navigable difference analysis of the specification, those 2 choices. Then we have transformation code that transforms between R3 resources and R4 resources. This needs a little bit of explanation, this one. So we have a mapping language in FHIR, which I'm going to talk about, I think, on Wednesday. The mapping language is an unusual language because it's fully declarative, and I'll talk why that's good on Wednesday. But then we use that language to write transforms between the R3 resource and the R4 resource. And then I actually test those as part of the build and then tell you how well they went as we publish the build. So you can see that for account we have 2 tests because there's 2 sample resources for account in release 3. So take the release 3 resource and I convert it forward to release 4. And 100% of those evaluated okay. And then I validate those against R4. So I want to know, if you took the release 3 resources and converted them to R4, are they valid? And you'll see that for account, 100% of them were. And then I convert them back with the back conversion map and check that that worked. And you'll see that that wasn't working for account when we published release 4. And And then, or in the case of activity definitions, 77% of them were working. So it gives you an idea, a very rough idea, of whether the conversion's even starting to be reliable. The problem with these conversions is committees change their assessment of the requirements based on feedback from the community from version to version as we go through the maturity process. Once we get to normative, these are 100% bulletproof conversions. I actually will maintain them and check them thoroughly. But when we're dealing with the other resources, committees will go, hey, we're not going to do that, we're going to do something else. And there is no generic conversion that will go from 3 to 4 when the committee said that. You can say, well, in this case, with this contextual knowledge, I can figure out what I would do instead in release 4, but given a release 3 resource, you don't know how to do that. And so that's mostly why the conversions fail, because I don't know how to do that conversion, but I provide what I can to get anybody going if they want to fill out the rest of the contextual knowledge that will make that conversion happen. And so those conversions, we published them with the spec, but then we've moved them into a GitHub repository. So if people would like to contribute to ongoing maintenance of those, we are welcome to take contributions. And then the other conversion code that we have is some Java conversion libraries. So they take release 3, or they take resources of one version and convert them all forward to other versions. Actually, this code is a nightmare, turning into a real nightmare for me, because it will actually convert between any version and any version. So each time we add a version, my permutational explosion goes up. And I maintain this Java code for the conformance resources that I need to be able to convert in order to run any of the infrastructure, for instance, to run the mapping libraries that I just talked about, or to do the validation, or so forth. So when it comes to code system, value set, structure definition, search parameter, capability statement, this code is 100% bulletproof, because I live and die by this code, and I maintain it with considerable passion. But when it comes to other resources, what happens is each time we cut a new resource, I clone all of the existing code or generate a one-to-one transform. So at the start of the year, after I published release 4, I created release 5. So all of the infrastructure that I run with now is called release 5, and we carry it forwards. And it's just a one-to-one transform between what release 5 was, release 4 is, and what release 5 was on the day I cloned it from release 4, when it was exactly the same. And then each time I regenerate the code, I have to go back and update the Java code. And any time it gets painful on any of the resources that I don't care about, I just comment them out. And the only ones I defend are the conformance resources. But more and more people are using this code in production and making contributions back to the code base to maintain the stuff that I don't particularly care about. So more and more people are caring about this code. Anybody's welcome to adopt bits of this code or contribute to bits of this code, but it is mightily painful to maintain. Another thing you can do, which we have code to do, is to put a facade in front of the versions. So you say, rather than convert between the versions, I'll write a facade. So basically the idea is you have a patient, and you say, look, the patient, if I look across all the versions of patient, I see the common stuff that I care about, and I don't care about the other stuff. So, for instance, a patient has a name, or a set of names. I just want to get the name, and I'll have a cross-version name that interfaces onto the underlying resource, and then I have a map, an implementation that maps from the patient resource in release 3, in this case, to iPatient. It's a lot of work to maintain this. Some of the reference implementations have this work partially done for the resources they care about. But it's like every time you change the interface, you've got to hunt down 3 or 4 versions, or 5 or 6, and fix them up. So it's a chore. But if you want to contribute to the reference implementations to do this, you're welcome. It's much easier to do it as a community. James and I do most of the work in Happy, where we have some of these. So those things exist. But yeah, it's a fair bit of work. So that's kind of a version conversion strategy. I mean, what happens generally is people just write their own conversions, but you can depend on those existing conversions. All right, API versioning strategy. First of all, I want to be clear that the resource version and the resource conversion is in everything. Here's an exchange between a client and a server where the client says, give me a patient with a particular ID and maybe some parameters, and provides a content type, gets back a content type, and gets back a body. The entire exchange is versioned. It's not just the resources that are versioned. The content type varies depending on the version. The parameters that are available varies with the version. The name of the resource varies with the version. We rename resources. So the entire exchange has a version. It's not just the resource that has a version. And we have no framework except for one very specific place, asking for a different version between request and response. So the entire exchange has a version. Now the simplest approach is to have multiple endpoints. So the test server, test.fire.org, has an R2, an R3, and an R4 endpoint. So each different endpoint expresses a different FHIR version. And then you can tell which FHIR version they are because you get the capability statement or the conformance statement for release 2, and then you look at the FHIR version and you know what FHIR version's in use. It's a bit circular because you have to parse the capability statement in the right version in order to find out what the version is. Version is such a problem, but you can do that. There's an easier way, but I'll get to that. This is a really simple approach, but it has a really major downfall, which is that the same logical record gets different URLs in different versions. And that is actually, can be pretty serious as a problem. So most of the servers started with the first approach, multiple endpoints, but increasingly it became problematic that the same logical record got different URLs, since that's kind of the identifier. So what if we had a single endpoint that could run multiple versions? So that's what we described how to do in release 4. So this is running, I think it's running still, on test.fire.org/rx, where the FHIR version parameter on the MIME type in the request, it applies to the resource and fixes the whole exchange. So you say, I want to get, in this case, the metadata, the capability statement, and I want you to send me your release 4 capabilities because I'm going to use release 4 for all the exchanges that follow. And so that FHIR version parameter on the MIME type describes the content of the exchange. And you can put it on either the content type or the accept header. And so the client chooses the version. All right, so the client says, well, hey, what versions can I use on the server? And so there's actually a way to ask the server. Say to the server, hey, tell me what versions you run on this endpoint. This was described in release 4. It's not mandatory for servers to run, but we would like every server to run to support this operation. It makes it so much easier for clients to navigate a multi-version framework ecosystem if they can just ask the server, what version do you run? So you say to the server, $versions, tell me the versions you run, and you get back a parameters resource telling you what versions the server runs and also what default version the server will use if the client doesn't specify a version. But there's actually a simpler way to run this where you say, just give me JSON back, don't give me FHIR JSON, and then you'll get a very simple JSON back. It's a special case for this operation, which tells you what versions you can run. And notice the versions are identified by their major and minor, but not their patch. We don't count the patch when we're talking about versions, because all the 3.0.x are all the same wire format. We'll never change that. We'll never break that. And we don't want to know about the patch version at this level. So we encourage all servers to do this, whether or not they're running multiple versions, just for ease for clients. So the server specifies what versions it supports, and the default it will use if the client doesn't say. The client queries and says, what can I use? I either am not compatible or I will choose which version to use, and that fixes all the exchanges that follow with the client's version parameter. And that works really well, and we've got people implementing that. But there's one tricky bit, and you can automate that, implement that on the infrastructure straight out of the spec, except for one thing, which is the spec. We have renamed search parameters from time to time, but we've never tracked that. No formal report of which search parameters have been renamed across versions. So the only way to manage that is to do it manually. It's on my to-do list to publish a concept map of the changes between search parameter names from version to version, but it's not done yet. Now there is a convert operation which builds on the MIME type to ask a server to do the conversion for you. So you can say post content to a server, say that you will accept FHIR version 3, but you are giving it FHIR version 4. Some of the servers implement this, including, I believe, Happy, although I haven't checked that with James. It does, yes, good. Happy supports it. Thanks, James. And so you can just, if you want to build this in line and you don't want to do anything with code, you just download the Happy CLI, run the Happy CLI, and just use this inside your code, inside your framework, and it will work. So it will do all the conversions in the standard. It'll use the Java code if the Java code is the working code for the conversion, and if that doesn't work, then it'll fall back and run the mapping libraries. Okay, now if you're doing non-API exchange, there's almost always a MIME type. Almost always, and if there's a MIME type, use a FHIR version parameter. If you're like embedding FHIR inside a V2 message, which happens in a few places in the world because you've got a V2 framework and you need to push FHIR content around, you've got a MIME type in the ED data type. If you're using EBXML or using Direct or whatever, you've got a MIME type. So you can use the FHIR version parameter to tell the recipient what version of FHIR it's receiving. But there's some times when that's just not possible. And if it's just not possible, you can actually put inside the message, inside the resource, you can mark it with a profile claim. Here's the claim that this patient resource conforms to the base structure definition, the base R4 patient. Now, it's quite possible that a patient resource could also conform to 3, as well as 4, as well as 5. So you could claim multiple claims for multiple versions, since that's quite possible. But that's the standard format that we've described for a claim that a resource conforms to a particular version. And if you try, you'll find that that resolves to the correct structure definition if you actually use that URL. So that's all the exchange frameworks that we have. When it comes to persistence, the first thing I say to people is if you're going to persist resources, you should always know what version the resource has. You don't want to be reading a persisted resource to find out what version it is. Store the version next to it unless you know the version. So most people, if you store resources directly, then they're all the same version and it's fixed in the code and you don't need to ask version 4 or 3 or whatever. But if you're storing multiple versions, don't make it so you have to look inside the resource. Store the version explicitly. You should only use the profile marker that I showed you at the last slide if you really need to. This, at the bottom here, this profile marker It's your last resort option. Just don't use it if you can possibly avoid it. It's your last resort. Now, in general, when you're dealing with persistence, you have 3 options. In fact, I realised I missed something before. A lot of people, when they implement the FHIR API, they put a facade of their API in front of a relational database. In fact, that's probably the majority implementation thing to do. And then what you generally end up doing if you're supporting multiple versions is just write 2 stacks or 1 stack for each implementation, each version you're implementing, and they just run in parallel. They share some underlying framework libraries, and they just implement the search parameters and the data conversions directly, and so you just get parallel code. And most of the vendors who've implemented multiple versions, that's how they do it. So if you're doing that, then none of what I'm talking about here is relevant to you. But if you're actually storing resources directly, so quite common now in clinical data repositories, in general, you really have 3 options if you're going to live in a multi-version world. The first is that you can store the resources as you get them, and then convert them on the fly to the other version if it turns out you need them in another version. Or you can store resources in your own internal preferred version and convert them when you first see them, if you need to. And so you have this single version database. Or you can extract information from the resources and store it in a relational database. So that's kind of the API model I just spoke about. But you can actually do all 3 things at once. Increasingly, this is what I'm seeing. Clinical data repositories in particular. The first thing you do when you get a copy of a resource submitted one way or another is you store it as you saw it in some audit-ish database. So you're keeping it for audit purposes. Then you convert it to the version that you're using internally, and you stick it in your actual master data repository. And then when you upgrade that, you upgrade every resource in that in one shot to if you upgrade the whole product. And then you build specific tables out of those to drive indexing for performance or other kinds of application workflow. And I'm actually starting to see some clinical applications written like that as well. They're saying, you know, we get this vast amount of stuff sent to us, and every so often we need to care about it, but mostly it just comes in and out and we don't really need to worry about it. But we have our own very controlled application functionality. So I'm seeing more applications designed like this. But of course, this is only advice. We don't have any rules in FHIR about this. Now, when it comes to documentation strategy, your servers, or your client, but mostly servers, when it comes to documentation, is implementing multiple versions. You have different documentation for different versions because the rules are a bit different. So one option then is to actually have 2 sets of documentation, 1 for each version. And that's kind of cool for the people who are doing only 1 version, but it's kind of difficult to maintain because you'll have multiple repetitions of the narrative. For sure they'll get out of sync because that's how it works. And then if the implementers are actually doing both versions, which some of them will be, they're ending up cross-comparing to see if anything's different between the versions and trying to figure out whether they are or not. So your other choice is to have 1 set of documentation with pairs of profiles and value sets and examples and so forth, and then you explicitly describe in the documentation where they're different. And that works really well for implementers who are doing cross-version stuff, and it's a tax for the implementers who are only doing 1 version, who have to then filter out the stuff about the other version that they don't care about. So basically, this is moving deck chairs around the Titanic. And which is better depends on which your implementers are. But one thing I call out, I've seen a lot of implementers who come to me and go, but you don't understand, my business rules change between FHIR versions. Why? Why did you hook up your business rules to an external version of the specification? It's like an anti-pattern, but a lot of people come to me and say, that's how we work. we had these interfaces in FHIR Release 2, and then we upgraded to FHIR Release 4 and we changed our business rules. So we took that opportunity to impose new business rules. You're like, so actually you're running two different interfaces in parallel with different business rules on different interfaces. This sounds like a really stable arrangement to go forward with. It's very common in version 2 in particular that people said, well, I had a version 2 interface, I ran with that for 10 years, and it was on 2.2, then I upgraded to 2.4, but the reason I upgraded to 2.4 was because I was imposing new business rules on the interface anyway, and so I made everybody change, and I figured I'd change versions while I was doing it. But in that case, really, you're actually driving people to upgrade anyway. So it's not really the same as multiple versions on the same product at the same time. And then, of course, there's a question about documentation versions. For us, these are implementation guides. So sometime this week, tomorrow maybe, I will release, or we will release, a new version of US Core. So US Core so far has US Core version 1 and US Core version 2, or Release 1 and Release 2, and they've both been based on FHIR Release 3. So the next one logically is the third version of US Core, but it's based on the fourth version of FHIR. So it'll be US Core R3 for FHIR R4. Does everybody see the problem there? Alternatively, we can, and so we've been talking about this, we could say, well, this is clearly, it's going to call Release US Core R4. We skipped Release 3, which we did with FHIR, right? We released, technically, we skipped version 2 technically. So we call it US Core R4 for R4. So what do we do when we do the next version of US Core, which will also be based on R4? Yeah, we're still arguing about that. We've been arguing about it for months. Actually, it's going to land by tomorrow because I'm publishing it tomorrow. So it's going to be fun overnight. So documentation versions are yet another problem. All right, so managing multiple versions is expensive and painful, and there's some fantasy land where those problems don't happen. Has anybody got any questions or comments or whatever?
What?
Yeah. Yeah, all the way up the back there.
Curiosity, when you're doing those conversions, and let's say that DSTU2 has the value set 1, 2, and 3, and version 3 of the FHIR has A, B, C, D. And the concrete example I'm thinking of is allergy and tolerance. Allergy and tolerance, criticality. Those kind of changed, the names changed, and I think there was more than one. There's an extra element in the third version. Are you just arbitrarily making a decision to convert 1, 2, 3 to A, B, C, D, and then you reverse it, or you do the reverse? How are you making those decisions? Are you getting input, or are you just picking them?
When the codes are normative, then, when the codes are actually explicitly documented, then I convert the codes. And the committees know that in the final few weeks while we're finalising a release, and I'm going through doing all the conversions, they can expect to get some hard questions about what they think they've done with some of the codes. And sometimes the answer's, oh, whoop, we missed that. So it's a big quality thing for the spec. But then other times they're like, yep, it doesn't work, but we're sticking with it. And so then the conversions are just a problem. And there's other times when they've changed the value set, and on external terminology, I just convert them anyway. That's become too hard. I did mean to mention, by the way, I just thought of it while I was doing this, we're planning to release a JavaScript client that is version agnostic for US Core. So that you just use the JavaScript client, you treat it as if you're dealing with a Release 4 server, and if you happen not to be dealing with a Release 4 server, you won't know about it. You don't need to know about it, it'll just work. So we're working on that. I meant to talk about that in my presentation, I forgot. There was a question, another one there. Yeah, you. Sean can wait. Yeah, that'd be good. A mic would be good.
So I have a question about FHIR. I attended a session on FHIR mapping language, and they said that that would take care of the versioning. Can you talk about that? What the different versions?
We use the mapping language in the maps that I talked about earlier in the presentation, but the mapping language doesn't exactly take care of the mapping. It's just a language in which we express our best shot at the relationship between the versions. But it's not always possible to get it right. And if anybody ever wants to contribute to those, we have a GitHub repository where you can do that. All right, Sean.
If a single server supports multiple FHIR versions, do you envision that you'll be able to perform a single search across multiple versions?
We have no framework by which you could possibly do that. And I also forgot to mention as well, we have no framework by which you can mix multiple versions in a single bundle. And a few people have asked, but we have no idea how we could make that reliable and workable. So we've just kept out of it. If you want to mix multiple versions in a single file, use something with MIME types in it, like a MIME package or something. I wish I had a magic bullet for you there, but no. And in fact, if you go back here, store resources as you get them. Indexing becomes a tremendous challenge, because what does it even mean to search across multiple versions? The search parameters have different names, and they have different semantics between versions. Yeah, very problematic. I don't recommend that one if you're doing anything at all intelligent. Not all of us do stuff that's intelligent, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess one question in terms of what you're seeing in the market right now, what people are doing with FHIR, how many server implementations are truly just, I use the term dumb in a non-pejorative way here, how many of the server implementations are really just storing and indexing streams of FHIR resources as JSON essentially, and how many of them are really just using that as an intermediate to an internal canonical model of some kind, either an operational database or something like that, where these issues kind of become moot because really it's the code that's translating from their operational model to the FHIR model.
So it's very use case based. If we talk about enterprise information systems running operational healthcare systems, of which EHRs are one category, and maybe LISs and RISs and PASs, but if we talk about that set of products, then 99% plus is facades onto a relational store of some kind or other that just do conversion on the fly. In as much as they've invested, they'll be running one version. If they're running more than one version, they're just parallel stacks. And whatever it is just stored back against the database, although we're starting to see design modifications coming from multiple FHIR versions, so even then it's just not simple anyway. A different use case would be a clinical data repository. The numbers flip. I mean, we have existing clinical data repositories, SQL based, but even those, I'm seeing those starting to get rewritten because it's so hard doing a clinical data repository with a limitlessly extending schema. And so increasingly people are just saying, well, I'm just going to store JSON and do my analysis straight off JSON with the web tooling. And so the numbers, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's flipping. And so that you're starting to, seeing a lot of JSON or protobuf or RDF stores that are storing native content. In terms of versioning, which is related to what you asked, in the States here, we got a very strong, the EHR data was R2, the other Argonaut specs were R3, but we're all looking, saying we're going to go R4. In Europe, there's a real lot of work on R3. Nobody's doing anything with R2 in Europe. Europe's looking at going, yeah, we don't really know about R4. We're not sure about the value proposition. There's other communities, whether it's still on R3s, who've already said they're waiting for R5 or R6, if that's a good idea. In Australia, we've said we're going to R4 across the board. Just because we say that doesn't mean it happens, you know how that works, but those are the useful policy prescriptions I can talk about. All right, any other questions? Time's just about up, but one last question. If someone, yeah, all the way over the back again.
Or the object models, the Pojo object models, like how can you avoid not writing your business logic against a specific domain model, the Pocos?
What I call the Andy pattern is changing your business rules in sync with changing the version of your external format. It's not quite the same as what you just asked about. So you have to write your implementation against something, that's for sure. And so, of course, you write your business rules and you bind them to something, to a particular version. But I think the anti-pattern I was commenting on is the assumption that, and a number of people have come to me with this going, I don't understand how this even works because our business rules are tied to our version. No, your business rules should be tied to your business rules. And if you're going to change your business rules, then you go and negotiate with your business partners. And you know, maybe you have a business rules field that tell them what business rules apply. I just think that should be a separate discussion from what version of the external specification. But you definitely need to bind to that, and validation and so forth is all, in the end, version specific. Yes. All right, so that's yeah, well, it's a bit flexible because it's the last session, but officially time's up. So no more questions. Thanks.